So far as I know, the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth is truly unique amongst Tolkien's writing on account of its combination of form and function. For the most part, the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth is a play, of all things. It is a dialogue written in alliterative verse between two men, one a young, idealistic poet, and another man, a grim, man-of-the-earth veteran, as they travel to collect the body of Beorhtnoth, Earl of Essex, from the battlefield of Maldon. That's the homecoming. These men are bringing the body home. The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth is then a work of historical fiction, or fan fiction almost, since the conversation that Tolkien imagines in this play takes place just after the historical Battle of Maldon in 991, which would in turn inspire the medieval battle poem of the same name. Now, that would make the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth interesting in and of itself, but here's where it gets cool. This work of fiction came out in 1953, at the height of Tolkien's academic career, after he had published The Monsters and the Critics and On Fairy Stories and was in the middle of a tremendously successful career as a professor of Oxford. But when this work of fiction came out, it was published in a scholarly journal, Volume 6 of Essays and Studies. In other words, not only is it a fictional work of incredible creativity and craftsmanship, but it carries Tolkien's full academic weight because it was published within a scholarly context. If that sounds weird, it profoundly is. Tolkien knew this, which is why, to help, he packages the poem-play thing by surrounding it with two more scholarly essays, which set up and explain some of the points he's trying to make within the poem. These scholarly essays within the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth are still cited in Maldon scholarship today, which makes the Homecoming more cool, but not less strange. So hi, I'm Dr. Gavin Davis, and in this video, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite things that Tolkien ever wrote. In the words of its recent editor, Peter Grabowskis, the Homecoming defies easy categorization. Is it literature? Yes. Is it scholarship? Also yes. Is it a poem? Absolutely. Is it theatrical dialogue intended for shadow theater with minimal special effects? Somehow also yes. The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth roots itself in the medieval Battle of Maldon poem. So to begin this introduction of Tolkien's work, I'm going to start with a quick and dirty guide of the 10th century poem. Believe me, it's important context for understanding who Beorhtnoth is and the intervention Tolkien tries to make with his work. After introducing the historical poem that is the basis for Tolkien's Homecoming, I want to walk you through each of the three parts that make up the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth. And I'll end with what I think the value of this work is today, since it has shifted over time. Scholarship on Maldon has progressed in the last 70 years, but I think elements of Tolkien's intervention have held up better than any traditional scholarly essay could. Finally, before we start, if you like old books with swords in them, I have to just quickly mention my Patreon. If you like what you see in this video and want to be a part of keeping this channel going for only $3 a month, see the link in the description for more information. But for now, let's get to the content. Maldon. Let's get to it. In the year 991 CE, England was once again faced by the threat of Viking invasions. A fleet of Viking ships were ravaging the southeastern coast of England when they landed on a tiny island at the mouth of a river not too far away from the town of Maldon. This was a good place for them to disembark, but the only way for the Vikings to get from their ships to the mainland, and thus to Maldon, was via a narrow strip of land, a tiny causeway, only a few meters wide, that survives to this day. And it was here at this choke point that the Vikings were stopped by an army of English defenders led by an old man named Beorhtnoth. Almost all the information we have about the battle comes from a poem fragment, only 325 lines long. Although this poem is clearly a literary object with plenty of creative license, it was probably written within a decade of the historical event, and it has a shocking amount of detail. And whether or not those details are 100% historically accurate or not, how the story is told, how it dramatizes the battle, tells us almost as much about how people were remembering the event. I've just come out with 2 videos that get much more into the detail of this poem, so if you want to see those videos, I've linked them in the description below. The poem picks up the action with the two sides, the Vikings and the English, standing off on either side of the causeway. The Vikings demand tribute, payment in money to avoid battle. It seems the Vikings may have well outnumbered the English. But Beorhtnoth promises the Vikings that they're going to have to fight this out. They skirmish over the causeway, but the English are in too good a position and they can't be pushed off. Which brings us to the crux in the narrative. The poem says that the Vikings began to use guile by asking the English for free passage across the causeway so they could properly advance their troops. Basically, it seems like the Vikings are calling on the English to fight them fairly. And the line in the poem of Beorhtnoth's response is this. Tha se earl ongan for his Ofermode, alu van landes to fela, latere theode. Then the earl, on account of his overmode, allowed too much land to the loathed people. Ofermod is a tough word to translate exactly, as you'll see later in this video, but it loosely correlates to pride. In other words, what seems to be happening here is that because of his pride, Beorhtnoth pulls his men back to fight the Vikings on even ground, and as a result of this decision, the English at Maldon are destroyed. The English take heavy losses. Beorhtnoth himself is cut down along with his bodyguard, and some of the English begin to break and flee. And although the rest of the poem deals with the defiant final moments of those who stayed and fought to the death, the battle is a disaster for the English. So, what is Ofermod? What compelled Beorhtnoth to give up the causeway? And considering the consequences of this fateful decision, what does this say about Beorhtnoth? As to answers to those questions, Tolkien had some strong opinions. The thing we call the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Berthelm's son, is divided into 3 parts, which as far as I can tell, were always published together. Part 1 is a mini essay titled Beorhtnoth's Death. It's only like 5 pages long, and all it really does is introduce the context around the Battle of Maldon, like we just did, introduce who Beorhtnoth was, and tee the reader up for Part 2, the play itself, by introducing Tolkien's made-up characters and how they fit into the story. According to a later medieval, semi-legendary tradition, the bishop of the nearby cathedral went to the battlefield shortly after the fighting was over to collect the headless body of Beorhtnoth. After all, Beorhtnoth was a prominent figure in English politics at the time, and he'd been a great sponsor of the church, so might as well go get him. Tolkien's play enters into this tradition as he invents the characters of 2 men, sent by the bishop to finish the last leg of the journey to actually recover the body. These 2 characters are Torthelm, an enthusiastic young poet who has little worldly experience but is full of love for the songs of old, and Tydwald, an old farmer who is himself the veteran of many battles. Tolkien is a better writer than I ever will be, but bless his heart, I wish he'd picked different names. Throughout the poem, the 2 characters call each other by their nicknames, Tida and Tata, and it took me embarrassingly long to get these straight. Part 2 of The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth is the poem play thing itself, Tolkien's fictional insert into England in 991. It's about 19 pages long and consists entirely of the dialogue between these 2 men as they travel to the battlefield, recover the body, and begin making their way back home. There is, beautifully, a footnote that says, "It was indeed plainly intended as a recitation for 2 persons, 2 shapes in dim shadow, with the help of a few gleams of light, and appropriate noises, and a chant at the end. It has, of course, never been performed." Apparently there was actually a BBC radio drama that performed this, and unsurprisingly, Tolkien actually wasn't very happy with it. The play is overwhelmingly something that's supposed to be heard, since it's also a poem, since all of the lines are written in alliterative verse. This means that even though it's in modern English, the verse form, the poetic structure, recreates the sound of vernacular medieval poetry from this period. Here's an example, so you get an idea of what it sounds like, who the characters are, and how it engages with the Battle of Maldon poem. Tydwald lets out again the light of the dark lantern. "Look here, my lad, where they lie thickest. Here, lend a hand. This head we know. Wulfmare it is, I'll wager aught. Not far did he fall from friend and master. His sister son, the songs tell us, ever near shall be at need, nephew to uncle. Nay, he's not here, or he's hewn out of ken. It was the other I meant, the East Saxon lad, Wulfsten's youngster. It's a wicked business, to gather them ungrown, a gallant boy, too, and the makings of a man." Without getting too deep into the reading, I want to highlight a few things. One, while the verse form is impressive, I'm struck with how casually Tydwald and Torthelm speak to one another. There are a few moments when Torthelm recites his beloved poetry, and in those moments the verse elevates and is beautiful. Tolkien is so skilled in writing in this ancient style. And yet, like Shakespeare's plays, which were also written in verse, Tydwald and Torthelm's distinct personalities resonate even through this archaic verse form. Torthelm, the young poet, is full of high ideals and ancient lyrics. Look, if you're this far into this video, you, like me, are probably also a fan of old medieval stories. And so it's so easy to be sympathetic to Torthelm. He's a skilled poet, and he wants the world to be like the songs that are so beloved to him. And yet the young Torthelm is made very uncomfortable by the battlefield they're walking through, showing that he's struggling to reconcile what he loves with what he sees around him. The other man, Tydwald, is a veteran, an old farmer, man-of-the-earth type, and he honestly is quite hard on Torthelm, especially as they pick their way through the bodies on the battlefield. There's no mistaking that Tydwald's experience is more pragmatic, if not a little heartbreaking, and he becomes kind of a hard check to Torthelm's idealism. This tension between the two characters makes their moments of connection very moving, even if they are few. For example, in the passage we read, the two men have a bit of confusion over the name Wulfmare. Tydwald finds a dead man named Wulfmare, and the young Torthelm mistakes this Wulfmare for the nephew of Beorhtnoth. Tydwald corrects Torthelm that no, this is a different Wulfmare, and that Beorhtnoth's nephew has yet to be found, unless he is somehow mangled beyond recognition. But if you've read the poem or saw my last video, you'd know that there were two Wulfmares at the battle, that both had died, and that Beorhtnoth's nephew had, in fact, been badly cut to pieces in the fight. It's a tough story. The drama of the conversation, especially Tydwald's toughness on his young companion, is astonishing. And I would think that such a grim attitude might be the contrived imaginings of a fantasy writer, but remember that in addition to being an expert on this medieval material, Tolkien himself had fought in the Battle of the Somme, witnessed the horrors of trench warfare, and had a son in the RAF in the Second World War. So with both academic credentials and genuine wartime experience, that Tolkien can speak through the words of the veteran in this story. You can talk, Tata. Your time will come, and it'll look less easy than lays make it. Bitter taste has iron, and the bite of swords is cruel and cold when you come to it. Then God guard you if your glees falter. When your shield is shivered between shame and death is hard choosing. It is poignant, both dear in its genuine love of old stories and bitter in its reflection on war. It doesn't offer easy answers, and it is unresolved, which makes it all the stranger that it was published in a scholarly academic journal. Unless you're a publication that, is known for publishing creative writing, scholarly journals tend to stick to the more clinical analysis of literature, which makes it all the more odd that this creative piece made it into such a scholarly context. Which brings us to part 3 of the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, which is a traditional scholarly essay titled Ofermod. In this short essay, Tolkien kind of justifies the presence of the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth in this academic journal by spelling out over 8 pages a more clear-cut argument for why he thinks the Maldon poem criticizes Beorhtnoth and the kind of honor he represents. Tolkien acknowledges the importance of the famous lines 3:12 through 3:13, which Tolkien renders as, "Heart shall be bolder, harder be purpose, more proud the spirit, as our power lessens." This line, spoken by one of the lower-ranking men, captures the essence of what Tolkien calls the heroic spirit, the idea of fighting for a greater purpose regardless of personal cost. And Tolkien generally seems to admire this quality. But Tolkien believes that Maldon's depiction of heroism can only be properly understood within the context of lines 89 and 90, the crux we discussed earlier, which Tolkien renders as, "Then the Earl, in his overmastering pride, actually yielded ground to the enemy as he should not have done." Most people in Tolkien's day were familiar with W.P. Kerr's translation. "Then the Earl, for his overboldness, granted ground too much to the hateful people." Over in Ofermod is an intensifier, like over or excessive. Mode means the spirit or the soul, one's heart, or if you want, pride. Paring these down, then, you could attempt to justify a translation like excessive boldness. And this could be framed to be rather generous to Beorhtnoth, like, gee, he was a good ruler, he was just too courageous in that moment and made a tactical error. Tolkien would strongly disagree with this reading. You see, if we look outside from this specific use to other contexts, Ofermod is overwhelmingly used as a word of condemnation. It is excessive pride. Also, in Old English, many words took on new or different meanings when used in poetic contexts. And in poetry, the noun form of Ofermod is only ever used in reference to two people, Beorhtnoth and Lucifer. Which means Beorhtnoth's pride isn't pride like the pride of a man who always does his best to do the right thing kind of pride. No, this is the root of all sin kind of pride. And Tolkien states as clearly as you like, even with the use of italics, that these are lines of severe criticism. Tolkien doesn't think that Beorhtnoth is the villain, or even necessarily a bad guy. Tolkien says in the same sentence that this severe criticism is not incompatible with loyalty and even love. Beorhtnoth was an important person in 10th century England, and the poem does memorialize him by giving him a glorious death. But this, for Tolkien, is all part of a broader point that Tolkien's trying to make about the nature of heroism. Heroism to Tolkien was the doctrine of uttermost endurance in the service of indomitable will. In its truest, purest form, a hero should be able to endure the worst the world has to offer in the service of some higher value, even if there is no one around to see them do it. But Tolkien points out this form of heroism is never wholly pure, since there is always something in it for the hero, their good name, their honor. Now, it may be that this sense of honor could be basically innocent, like your sense of self-worth, your self-esteem that keeps you in check. But it's when this desire for honor becomes an end in itself, a value for its own sake, it becomes excessive, the over and over mode. This self-serving kind of honor for its own sake is what Tolkien identifies with chivalry. Yet this element of pride, in the form of a desire for honor and glory in life and after death, tends to grow, to become a chief motive, driving a man beyond the bleak, heroic necessity to excess, to chivalry. Excess, certainly, even if it be approved by contemporary opinion, when it not only goes beyond need and duty, but interferes with it. In other words, while heroism is neutral, or maybe even good, chivalry is bad, since it is ultimately self-serving, even if it is accomplishing something convenient. Chivalrous people can accomplish heroic things, but it is the heroism that makes that action valuable, not the chivalry. This concept of chivalry, or rather this intense critique of chivalry, is a common theme that Tolkien identifies across the literature of the Middle Ages, specifically in Beowulf at the beginning, Maldon in the middle of the Middle Ages, and in the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight near the end of the Middle Ages. All of these stories, while seemingly heroic tales on their surface, ultimately come round to critiquing those who would pursue honor as an end in itself. It should be noted that although Tolkien levels his critique of the excesses of heroism on Beorhtnoth, Tolkien exempts the warriors who served Beorhtnoth and fought to the death. Tolkien believed that Beorhtnoth had a choice of whether or not to fight to win or to fight for honor, that Beorhtnoth chose the fair fight on account of his excessive honor, and that this was the wrong choice, because it hazarded the lives of his warriors and the safety of England for his personal honor. Beorhtnoth had a responsibility to those under him, and by putting his honor first, he failed. But not so for the warriors, since in Tolkien's view they didn't have a responsibility downwards, only a duty of loyalty upwards. Unlike their leader, they didn't choose to increase their personal honor by fighting fairly. No, somebody else made a choice, and theirs was to do or die. Sure, some stay and fight on account of their personal sense of honor and fear of reproach, but that's why it is so meaningful. That's one of the lowest ranking warriors who speaks the famous words of courage in the poem, since it's those at the bottom of the social ladder who had the least to gain and the most to lose. Ultimately, I think Tolkien's focus on class is really interesting. Tolkien is stern in his indictment of those who would pursue honor as an end in itself, but he is scathing towards those who choose personal honor at a cost to those they are responsible for. The Battle of Maldon is a poem about the courage of warriors in the face of certain defeat. And while it's exciting to focus on the theatrics of heroism on display, Tolkien's The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, in all three parts, argues that Maldon is also a part of a long literary history that is profoundly critical of those who would seek honor as an end in itself, especially when it causes suffering to those the honorable are responsible for. There could be no more pungent criticism in a few words of chivalry and one of responsibility than Wiglaf's exclamation, "Oft shall Earl monig honest willan rack a draogan." By one man's will, many must woe endure. These words the poet of Maldon might have inscribed at the head of his work. I feel like I'm still ramping up towards something. There's so much going on in the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth Bairnhelm's and while I carefully avoided the issue of Ofermod in my dissertation's chapter on Maldon, I love this poem and the issues the poem seems to be engaging with. So in conclusion, there's one final question I want to discuss. Does the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth hold up today? The answer, I think, is yeah, absolutely. But it is a deeply qualified yes. The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth is still regularly cited in Maldon's scholarship, but more as the beginning of the scholarly conversation around Beorhtnoth's actions rather than the definitive end. The essay Ofermod is the most cited of the three parts, which makes sense. It's where Tolkien most directly states his thesis and makes his claims. But the essay has some weaknesses. In the years since, scholars have hotly contested the interpretation of Ofermod and the morality of Beorhtnoth's actions. Many side with Tolkien that Ofermod is a genuinely critical term and have mustered additional examples or evidence to support it. Others have pointed out that this is one line in a poem that seems to be really generous towards Beorhtnoth. So it might not be best practice to shift the interpretation of the entire rest of the poem according to a single word that we don't know a ton about. After all, even in modern English, the concept of pride is very slippery. If I'm allowed my own opinion, though, I think I find the arguments that Ofermod is sinful pride more convincing. And while it makes the reading of the rest of the poem more challenging, I think that's something we get to wrestle with. If you're interested in some sources on this conversation, there are many, but here are just a few. There are some other sticking points, however. For example, historians of medieval battlefield tactics have pointed out that perhaps Beorhtnoth had to give the Vikings ground in order to force an engagement. If Beorhtnoth had just held the causeway, the Vikings had superior mobility. They were on an island and they had ships. They could have just packed up their boats and left, and then sacked the next town over. So although it was risky, perhaps this was Beorhtnoth's best chance at just maybe stopping the Vikings who had already raided multiple towns along the coast. The poem fragment doesn't say anything about this, though, so it might not be fair to interpret this poem based on armchair battle tactics. We weren't there, and we have to work with the evidence that is available to us. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, even though the ideas of heroism and chivalry are central to the argument Tolkien makes in the third part of the Homecoming, I would be really careful when using his definitions of these terms, which are not exactly the definitions that most people are familiar with. What chivalry means to me might be different than what chivalry means to you, which might be different than what chivalry meant to Beowulf, who never heard the word in his entire life. I think Tolkien's interest in how concepts change over time is really interesting, and he supports his use of these terms by defining them in ways that can almost support the anachronism of talking about Beorhtnoth's or Beowulf's chivalry. There is a longer conversation to be had here, but practically speaking, while Tolkien's definitions might work within the context of this argument, These are profoundly complex terms that exist outside of Tolkien's argument with widely diverse meanings, so we need to be really careful to avoid false equivalence. But here's the thing. Tolkien's essay, Ofermod, is only part of the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, and I think it's not even the most important part. It's the poem, the play, the dialogue at the center between Tolkien's imagined characters who hash out some of these big questions amongst the dead and exist within this nebulous space of interpretation, just as we hash out what all these big words mean as we pick our way through scattered medieval poems. That, I think, is the most important part of the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth. I get why it's the final essay that's cited more. It states the argument and supports it with the available evidence. It makes the argument more accessible, and it ages it more quickly as new evidence or other considerations appear. But the dialogue is so much richer. It does require more work to interpret, since we have to engage with it as the artistic, creative piece that it is. But this makes it provocative and unresolved, and as a modern work of medievalism that bridges an ancient poem with the timeless issues of heroism, valor, poetry, and the cost of conflict, that the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth ages beautifully. There's a line in the middle of the poem when Torthelm and Tidwald finally discover Beorhtnoth's decapitated body. They have a moment of silence, and then Torthelm chants a beautiful eulogy. But my favorite line comes after, with the grim old veteran's response. "Brave words, my lad. The woven staves have yet worth in them for woeful hearts, but there's work to do ere the funeral begins." I love these poems because they are beautiful, and as they talk about tough things, they don't give simple answers. That's how the Maldon poem is. And I love how Tolkien has the audacity to deliver his most influential criticism on this poem in a poem as well. That's all for this video, folks. If you want to grab a copy of The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, this is the 2023 J.R.R. Tolkien, The Battle of Maldon, together with The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth. It is a compilation of a bunch of Tolkien's work on Maldon, including the complete Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, some other essays on the poem, and Tolkien's own prose translation of the original Battle of Maldon poem. The other essays in this work are fine. They're really crunchy linguistics analysis, if that's your thing, and the translation of the Maldon poem in here is fine as well. It's more of a rough and ready literal translation than a showcase of Tolkien's artistry. It's kind of like Tolkien's Beowulf, which I've reviewed earlier on this channel. But the star of the show here is The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth and the commentary provided by Peter Grabauskas. All three parts of The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth only take up the first 35 pages, but I think The Homecoming is an important piece of the Tolkien canon, and I think it is easily one of Tolkien's top 3 academic works. This alone might be worth the price of entry for you. If you're interested in grabbing a copy and want to help out the channel, there are affiliate links in the description below. If you use these, I get a little kickback from Amazon at no extra cost to you. I can't believe that it's only been 4 months since this channel started. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, check out my other videos on medieval literature. I have a PhD in English, and this channel is where I offer college-level content on old books with swords in them. And if you want to be a part of the community that's keeping this channel running, I have a Patreon where for $3 a month, you can help me make more of these videos. Researching and making these videos is my full-time job. And although the Patreon doesn't currently offer any extra benefits, it is the thing that gives me a stable enough income to keep teaching on this platform. If you're interested in joining, there's a link in the description below. And if you've already joined, know that all this is because of the support I receive from you. So thank you. I'm going to take a wee break for the holidays, but when I come back, I've got a book review I want to do. And in January, I want to start on the theories that interrogate medievalism, our modern memory of the Middle Ages, which if I could design a college course on any one thing, it would be that. I'm very excited for where this channel is going in the coming year. Until then, I'm Gavin the Medievalist, and I'll see you next time.